Well, welcome back, church, to our Wednesday evening Bible study of the book of Revelation. We're going to be in chapter 9. I won't do a large recap from last week because I am still trying to nurse along this hoarse voice. I'll probably be speaking in more subdued tones. I get a little animated when I teach sometimes. I'm going to try to avoid that so that I don't overuse my voice right now. Hopefully, it'll continue to do some healing. And I do have an appointment with the doctor soon to have him just to kind of look at everything, make sure everything's good and there's no more vocal polyps or any kind of abuse that's happening there. So we'll jump right in and begin at the beginning, which is Revelation chapter 9. The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth. And he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke of the shaft. Stop right there for a minute. We'll just kind of unpack these verses as we go through. This is an angel. We've already dealt with angels up to this point being representative of certain things. The scholarly debate has always been as to whether this angel is a good angel doing God's work or an evil angel who God is using even in his evilness to ultimately do God's work. Either way it works. The word that is used here for fallen from heaven is the word that where the stars fell from heaven. So it has to do with judgment. So some folks think that this is probably an angel that is fallen, a fallen angel. However, he's given a key to the shaft for the bottomless pit. And that word is abyss in many translations. The word abyss meaning no bottom. It seems like you just fall forever. It is also the word in the Old Testament that the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament uses to translate the word tehom, which is the deep or watery chaos, from which God brought chaos into creation at the very beginning in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep, the tehom, the waters. And from that tahom or that chaos, God brought order. So what we're seeing here is the reversal of what God has done in creation in order. We're going to see a good bit of disorder in this chapter. When the smoke comes out, it darkens the sun and the air. The sun is the light by which humans see. So the light has been darkened. And there are a lot of people who are being led into darkness or into idolatry. Verse 3, when the smoke came up, also locusts came up on the earth, and they were given authority, like the authority of scorpions on the earth. They were told not to damage the earth, the grass, the earth, or any green growth or tree, but only the people who had not the seal of God on their forehead. So this is in line with the plague in Egypt, where the locusts came. This would have been a terrifying scene for the people in the ancient East to think about locusts, because the locusts came in and they usually ate up everything that was green and that was growing in the crops, thus affecting the human food chain and causing starvation and death and disease. But these are not irregular locusts. Joel also uses the term locust to refer symbolically in the Old Testament to an invading army. These locusts are not to harm the grass, the trees, or anything that's green, but they are to put torment on people. So this does seem like an army, not a literal insect locust. Ironically enough, this is a part of the punishment or judgment that God is pouring out. And we know this because these were able to hurt but not kill anyone who did not have the mark. So everyone who is not a part of God's people God's property, are subject to being hurt by these locusts. Every culture has within it the fear of a hybrid animal, an animal like a scorpion and a snake. So you got the scorpion who stings and is venomous. You got the snake whose bite is also venomous. You know, this is a break between the natural order of order onto the other side of that line into chaos. And that's what seems to be being brought forth here. What is this? This is some kind of chaos. All right. They were allowed to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them. Their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. All right. In those days, people will seek death, but will not be able to find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. Ironically, of the horsemen, one of the horsemen that came out was death. So death was prevalent during that first set of judgments because of the famine, because of the war, because of everything that's going on. At this particular point, when the fear of this invading army strikes these people, and that's sort of like the sting of that scorpion, it's more of a dread or a panic of what could happen, not what actually is happening. God's people aren't afraid of what could happen because we know God has control. But these people are frightened of what could happen, and it's like a sting, and it's burdening them, and they are so frightful that they long to die, but death escapes them. Verse 7. In appearance, the locusts were like horses equipped for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces. Their hair was like woman's hair, and their teeth was like lion's teeth. They had scales like iron breastplates, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots and horses rushing to battle. They have tails like scorpions with stingers, and in their tails is their power to harm people for 5 months. They have a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek it is called Apollyon. The first woe is past, and there's still 2 woes to come. So this sounds like, to many scholars, the Parthian Empire, who is on the other side of the Euphrates River, and they are the mortal enemies of Rome. When Caesar Nero was supposed to have killed himself, many people thought that he either did kill himself and was brought back from the dead, reincarnated, or that he didn't kill himself, that he faked his own death. But almost everyone who thought that Nero was alive, no matter how he came back, whether came back from the dead or whether he actually never did die, felt like he was with the Parthians, our mortal enemies, raising an army, and that he was going to bring that army back and fight against Rome. It would be like the United States of America, knowing that the president had defected to Soviet Union and carried with him the nuclear football, the case that has all the launch codes for all of our missiles. We would be terrified. We'd be frightened because he knows all of our battle plans. He knows all of our secrets, and he's got access to all of our weapons. These people in Rome during this time, when John was writing this letter, were quite frightened that Nero might be coming back, and he might be bringing a horde of pagan army people with him, people who were not ordered and disciplined in battle like the Romans would have been, but people who were guerrilla warfare tactic people. These were people who fought differently. They painted themselves up. They were tribal people. They painted themselves up. They did not have well-cut hair like the Romans did, and again, in order, sort of orderly type military haircut. They let their hair grow long, like women's hair. They painted their face when they went into battle, like Mel Gibson on Braveheart. Their horses, it says, had stingers in their tails. One of the things that the Parthian army were known for is that they were as good with their bow and arrow, accurately shooting people in the front as they were charging into battle with their horse. But they were also just as good to turn and shoot behind them. So the arrows were coming from the horse's tail. They also wove the hairs of their horse's tail together that made them look like snakes on the back of the horse. So when they were running into battle, it looked like a bunch of snakes flapping on the back of the horse, and then arrows were coming from the back of the horse. It was very terrifying for people who are normally used to marching in a line, moving forward in battle, holding the phalanx with your shield and your neighbor's shield and interlocking arms, everything done in order. These people were just running all around, long hair, painted faces, metal breastplates where you can't penetrate with an arrow or sword. They were barbarians. It's where the term barbarian sort of gets its meaning from people like this. What seems to give it away that this might be a thought that this could be alluding to the Parthian army being led by a theoretical Nero who's come back from the dead is that in verse 11, the king they have over them is the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, which means destroyer. And in Greek, he is called Apollyon. And Apollyon sounds very much like the Roman god Apollo. And the Roman god Apollo was a god who was a god of music. He was a god of the lyre, the lyre that you play like a harp. And one of the reasons why Nero is connected with this, because again, the Nero Reditus myth, the belief that he had come back to life, that he was in Parthia, that he was getting ready to lead an army against Rome across the Euphrates and attack. And Nero was himself associated with, while he was Caesar of Rome, he was associated most with, and he made his patron god, the god Apollo, which is the god of the lyre, or the god of the harp. And Nero himself played the harp. You probably have heard someone say that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but he didn't fiddle. He was actually on stage and he was literally playing a harp. And of course, he always won, the Academy Award or whatever award they had in that day for the person who was the best player of the harp, whether he was good or not, because he's Caesar. You don't tell Caesar he lost. So when Rome was burning, it was actually an elaborate plan that Caesar actually had made. We'll talk about this later in this study, to actually burn down a section of the city. The whole city caught on fire. It got out of hand. He had his alibi that it wasn't him who did it, as he was fiddling or playing the harp while the city was burning. So he had a place that it wasn't him who did it. So he blamed it on the Christians, and that's how it started, the persecution, the great persecution of the Christians. These new Johnny-come-lately people who worship a guy who we crucified over in Jerusalem named Jesus Christ. And these people gathered together in the graveyards, the catacombs, where dead people are. And there they have agape love feasts. The way the Romans tried to spin this was love feasts were orgies. And while they're having those love feasts, what they do is they eat the flesh of a dead man and they drink the blood of a dead man. Well, ew, gross. That was easy to turn the whole Roman population sort of against these Christians and say, they're the ones who set our city on fire. They persecuted them. But Nero Caesar specifically, associated himself with Apollo. And the belief was, again, that he was over in Parthia. He was coming to destroy Abaddon, the destroyer. And he is associated with Apollyon, or Apollo, the god of the Roman pantheon. And there's coins actually minted when Nero was the Caesar that have the picture of Nero standing on one side of the coin playing the harp to associate himself with the god Apollo. Verse 12, the first woe is past and there are still two woes to come. Verse 13, the sixth angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar before God saying, the sixth angel who had the trumpet released the four angels who are bound in the great river Euphrates. So the four angels were released who had been held ready for this hour, the day, the month, and the year, to kill a third part of humanity. The number of the troops of the cavalry was 200 million. I heard their number. And this was how I saw the horses in my vision. And I'm going to stop right there because I want to back up and unpack what's going on here. So in heaven, on the altar of God, and the altar in Israel in the Old Testament had four horns on it. Horns represent power in apocalyptic literature. So four horns are God's perfect power. All four horns on the altar is God's perfect power. But also in the Old Testament, there was a there was a way that you could find mercy. If you were deserving of punishment or death, you would run to the temple and grab hold of the horns on the altar. As long as you had that, you had safety and security. You could hold on to the horns of the altar to find safety. When the horns of the altar don't provide safety, then things have really gotten bad. Not only are the horns here not providing the safety to people who deserve judgment, the horns of the altar are the ones who are speaking forth. This angel who's on the horns of the altar speaks and says, release the 4 angels who were bound in the river Euphrates. The river Euphrates is the river that ran between Babylon and Israel, from the Persian Gulf all the way up to Assyria. And therefore, it was the river that all of Israel's enemies crossed from the north coming down to Israel. So there's something about crossing a river here that seems to be operative in this part of this interpretation. The Euphrates River happened to also be the boundary on the eastern side of the Roman Empire between Rome and Parthia. As long as the 4 angels were bound in the river, it seems that the Parthian army couldn't come across. But as soon as these angels are released, they in fact are part of the judgment of God that helps to bring the Parthian across. So there's nothing hindering the Parthians from coming across the river now. And the troops are going to be massive. There's going to be 200 million. Of course, that number again is symbolic. It's not meant to be taken literal. It just means a god-awful number of soldiers are coming. And this is how I saw the horses in my vision. The riders wore breastplates. Remember, I said the Parthian army had breastplates. The color of fire and sapphire and sulfur. The heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. This is a direct connection with the Old Testament book of Job, chapter 41. You can look at that chapter. If you'd like to, you can pause the video and turn over to Job chapter 41, verses 19 through 21. And this is where the chaos monster, Leviathan, God said, or Job says that when he breathes forth fire and smoke and sulfur and that kind of thing. So again, this has got to do with chaos again. This whole thing is about a chaotic invasion and how people are frightened of what could come and what will happen. Now in history, the Romans and the Parthians fought back and forth. And the Parthians were the only countries that the Romans never actually conquered. They were always ended in a stalemate. The Parthians were eventually defeated by others, but Rome could not conquer them. So they were a feared foe. Verse 18, by these 3 plagues, a third of humanity was killed. This idea of a third keeps being repeated. If you remember, we had a third of the stars that fell from the sky. Now we've got a third of humanity that is being killed in battle. This great confluence of chaos, if you will. And again, God is the God of order and creation, bringing creation out of order. Demonic powers are the powers that bring chaos out of creation. So it reverses the process. It's almost like there's this back and forth, the good and evil fighting one another. Verse 19, for the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails. Remember, the Parthian army could shoot forward just as accurately as they could shoot backwards. In their tails, and their tails are like serpents. Remember, I said that the tails of the horses were woven together and braided in such a way as it looked like there were snakes on the back of the horses. Of course, that's a horrifying thought for anybody who's fighting them. You don't want to get bit by a snake. You make it through the battle. Don't get axed or stabbed or shot with an arrow, and all of a sudden a horse runs by you and one of those tails reaches out and pops you, and it's a water moccasin or a rattlesnake, and you die from a snake bite. Most of this is symbolic, but again, you can see how some of the symbolism actually might be code for people who would have seen this kind of thing and made the connections, what John was trying to tell them. The rest of humankind who were not killed by the plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, or of worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk. They did not repent of their murders, of their sorceries, of their fornication, and their thefts. The whole purpose of these judgments is, we need to be reminded of the fact, is not for spite or vindictiveness. While God is punishing sin in judgment, it's not simply for spite or vindictiveness. The whole purpose is, just like in Egypt when the plagues were poured down on Egypt, was for the Egyptians to turn towards God. But the more the plagues come, the less they were likely to turn to God. The more Pharaoh hardened his heart. Same thing's happening here. The plagues are designed to turn people to God. But ironically, it seems that they actually turn away from God. They don't stop doing the things that cause the plagues to come. One of those is worshiping demons. If you go through the Old Testament and into the New, excuse me, the idea of demons being connected with idol worship is replete. The belief is that the stone or the tree or the gold idol or whatever is nothing. But there is a power that thing represents that is something in the spiritual world, and it's demonic. So to worship an idol is not to worship the idol because the idol can't see, hear, or walk, because he mocks here. And that mocking is just the same type of mocking that happens in Isaiah chapter 56 through 66 in the Old Testament, where he says, what is an idol? A man takes a piece of wood, comes into his house, carves it, takes the shavings from the wood, puts it on a fire, warms himself, and cooks over the fire. And then he falls down and bows to the idol that he carved from the wood that he just burnt and said, "Save me." So how can that idol save you when it couldn't even save itself? You burned parts of it in the fire. So there's a sense of mockery, sense of poking fun at worshiping. The three types of metal that are mentioned here, gold, silver, and bronze, are the type of metal that would have been striking coins. And the coins always had the Caesar's image on it. Remember, Jesus said, when asked, who to pay taxes to, he says, "Show me a coin." And they showed him the coin, and he looked at it, saw Caesar's image on it, looked at it, and said, "You see this? Give to Caesar what's his, but give to God what's his." And what was Jesus saying? And the coin has the image of Caesar. So give that to Caesar. That's what he wants. Let him have it. But what does God want? What has God's image on it? You as a person, and therefore everything that you are and that you own or possess. So give to Caesar the things that have his image on it. Give to God the thing that has God's image on it, which is you yourself. They did not do that. And they continued in their sorcery and also their fornication. It's very important to remember, we've talked about this before, but in the Old Testament, when they worshiped idols, oftentimes they did it at pagan shrines that used sexual ritual as a part of the worship. It's hard for us to think about that, but that's what happened. So from the Old Testament on, the idea of worshiping an idol got connected to fornication, sexual immorality, adultery. You're supposed to be God's spouse. If you're part of the Old Testament people, the Hebrew people, God was the husband, Israel was the spouse. In the New Testament, Jesus is the bridegroom, we are the bride. If we worship another God, that's like cheating on a spouse. That's like sexual adultery or fornication. So that's what he alludes to here at the end. Now, of course, everything is about application. So what are we going to do to bring application to this passage for us? Well, God pours out judgment, and judgment is poured out. Sometimes God doesn't actively do it, like we said with the angel, sending an angel to open the bottomless pit to let the demons out. Sometimes somebody has the idea, hey, I'm going to open the pit, let the demons out. And evil happens. It's against God's will. It's not directed or mandated by God's will. It's not his mission, but it is by God's permission. Because if God's sovereign and God is powerful, he can stop it, but he don't stop it. So if he doesn't stop it, what's he doing? He's weaving it all together. This is what it means in the Bible when it says that God works all things together for good for those who love him, are called according to his purposes. It doesn't say all things are good. It says God uses all things for good, even bad things. So it's like a patchwork quilt that's been woven together. And on the backside of um, um, the loom, the thing where they weave the mat together, the backside of the rug, you see all the spools of thread that are, it doesn't make a picture at all. It's ugly. It's chaotic. Turn it around, and on the other side, you see that the master who's running the loom or the weaving of the fibers together has made a beautiful picture. So that's how it is with our lives. And that's what God is saying here, that even when judgment comes, God is operative in the world to weave it all together. And the judgment is ultimately for those who don't know God to be brought back to God. And they have choice. They can either come back or they can harden their heart. Here it says the Romans, they hardened their heart. We have the opportunity to harden our heart or to soften our heart. But if we are a part of the people of God, although Jesus says as a part of the church, you will suffer persecution. Don't think we're going to get out of having to suffer. We do suffer, but we will not suffer judgment. There's a big difference, and I've been trying to make that emphasis throughout the study, and I hope that you've got it. When God pours out judgment, it's on the world, that is the system that is against God's kingdom. Sometimes because of that judgment, things happen that overspill. The people who are being judged get angry, and they fight with God's people, and we suffer because of that. We could become a martyr. Somebody tells us to deny Jesus Christ or they're going to cut our head off. We're supposed to allow them to cut our head off. As hard as that sounds, that's what the Bible teaches. But that's not punishment. That's not judgment. That's the suffering that you and I will experience. It could be as little as being mocked, ridiculed, like we are in the United States oftentimes, told that we're stupid for believing in God, got to have a crutch to have faith. You need to believe in science and not faith and that kind of thing. You can believe in both, by the way. But it could be as small as just ridicule. It could be as much as martyrdom and killing you. Always be faithful to God. If you have the mark of God on your forehead or in your hand, meaning you're his servant, meaning you're his slave, nothing that punishment or judgment can do can fall on you. And that's very comforting as we think about this chapter this week. Again, I thank you for your time, your attention, and your attendance. I do pray and covet your prayers for my throat. It's still a little, it feels like sometimes that the muscles that you use to talk are oftentimes being worn down, like it gets sore to try to talk, and a little bit raspy in the voice itself. You could probably hear that rasp. It could be just allergies, could be acid reflux, could be anything. But again, on May the 6th, I do have an appointment with my ENT. So I covet your prayers in the meantime. And thank you for your forbearance and helping me to keep these lessons short and share with you the meat. And if you have more questions, we can talk about those in one-on-one. You can call me, you can email me, you can text me. Any way you have, we'll have dialogue on anything you have questions about. Thank you again for your attention and your attendance, and hopefully this is edifying and will help you with your discipleship.